The year is 1981 and a new machine is released by Sinclair, called the ZX81. This was a vast improvement over the ZX80, with 8K ROM, 1K RAM and a 3.5 MHz processor. Yes, maybe it was still tiny spec for the time, and yes, maybe it couldn't produce colours, but at least the ZX81 could do more than one thing at a time, and so wouldn't blank the screen each time you pressed a key. But it was the price that was a real winner with the machine, being £69.95 ready built, or £49.95 as a kit. It was cheap enough for anyone who was curious about the new world of computing. The machine went on to be a huge success. There are a few notable games made for the ZX81, such as 3D Monster Maze, a wonderful 3D maze which had you fleeing a T-Rex, released in 1981. Flight Simulator, released in 1982, one of the world's first flight simulator games, and Mazogs, also released in 1982. Over in Commodore in 1981, they released their new home machine called the VIC-20. It was a lovely little machine with good game-playing abilities for the time and price bracket. Notable games such as Cavern Fighter and Miner 24-9er, a game which would inspire a certain Matthew Smith to write a pseudo-unofficial sequel called Manic Miner on the Spectrum. In the business world, in 1981, IBM finally decided to build its own home PC to rival the Apple II, because more and more of their customers were buying Apple IIs to do more and more in the office. Knowing that they had to make something quickly, IBM agreed to buy off the shelf, not making any of the hardware and merely putting it all together. It was this open system which would allow Compaq in 1982 to reverse engineer the system and so produce their own compatible IBM machine. This year in 1981 the world saw its first video game magazine called Electronic Games. This was quickly followed by Computer and Video Games, or CVG for short. In 1982 the world was treated to a number of classic home consoles being released. First was the CBS ColecoVision, a lovely machine made all the better by a swathe of accurate home arcade conversions of some of the best games of the time. Notably there was Mr. Do, Donkey Kong and Zaxxon released. This was then followed by the wonderfully quirky Entex Adventurevision, which took the design of tabletop video game machines of the time, but allowed you to play one of 4 games released for the system. These were Defender, Space Force, Super Cobra and Turtles. But the big home console release for 1982 was the fantastic Vectrex by Milton Bradley. This game console came with a vector screen that allowed you to play vector games. Although only lasting 18 months from launch to its demise due to the video game crash in 1984, and being a little too much of a quirky gadget for the £149.99 asking price, it still holds a special place in people's hearts that have played the machine. Notable games is Armour Attack, a great little shooter, Spike, a wonderful 3D looking platform game where you got to play a hedgehog and his name wasn't Sonic, and Cosmic Chasm, an inventive arcade adventure game. Also in 1982 Atari came out with its follow-up system to the Atari 2600 called the Atari 5200 Super System. Actually, designs for the new Atari VCS console have been kicking around in Atari since 1979, but Ray Kassar, who saw the home computer as a future, didn't pursue it. So in 1981 Atari attempted to make a new computer to rival the Intellivision, but finding it far too difficult to program, they then decided instead to adopt the 1979 plans they'd originally put together, dubbing the machine as PAM, which they named after a lady employee, and also it stood for Personal Arcade Machine. The console was huge, especially when comparing it to the Atari 2600. I suppose the modern equivalent comparison would be compared to the original Xbox. The machine only sold modestly well, with most gamers not liking the new control pad, which was horrendous to use for a lot of games. They also felt it didn't offer enough of an upgrade when compared to the Atari 2600. In 1982, the arcades was another stunning year, packed full of gaming goodness, and yet again it was Namco's year. First we have Pole Position by Namco. It was actually published by Atari in the rest of the world, but made by Namco. The game had you race your Formula 1 car around numerous tracks around the world. But what was amazing for the game was the graphics with the behind car viewpoint and great handling, with which racing games ever since have copied the pole position mould. There was another classic by Eugene Jarvis, this time called Robotron 2084, and it's considered by many to be the best game of all time. It had you frantically running around shooting all the robots and rescuing all the humans. This was one of the first arcade games to have two joysticks, with one controlling the player's movement and the other to select the gun's direction. This year in '82, PAC-MAN had its first sequel, called Miss Pac-Man. It was actually a hack or modification of the original Pac-Man game, called Crazy Otto, from General Computer Corporation, and it offered Pac with new mazes. It was so good that the hackers offered it to Midway to license officially, and it went on to mass acclaim. Also released in '82 was a wonderfully novel game called Joust by John Newcomer at Williams. This original game had knights riding large ostriches, and the purpose of the game was to knock each other off your foul steed. Another shooter released in 1982 was Zaxxon by Sega. This game was a shooter but on the interesting isometric viewpoint, and had tight gameplay and lovely visuals. This year would also see Xevious released by Namco, one of the earliest vertical shoot-em-ups. It would be packed with ideas and would set the standards for vertical blasters to follow. This year also brought Dig Dug, also by Namco, which was a wonderfully bright and visually stunning platform game that had you digging your way around the level and inflating and hopping the enemies. Then we have the often overlooked Mr. Do by Universal. Bubbles by Williams had you floating around the sink collecting grease and food and ants whilst avoiding the razor blades and the scrub boards. Data East had two classic games out this year. There was Bump and Jump, a great overhead racer, and Burger Time, which had you running over your burgers whilst avoiding the dodgy bad food. Taito released Frontline, a great run and gun, one of the earliest of this type of game. Sega released Pengo, a platform puzzler where you had to push ice blocks to survive. Williams also released Sinister, which is quite a bizarre but entertaining blaster. Data East released Pro Tennis, which was one of the first modern tennis style games. And Tutankhamun by Konami, another novel platform game. Finally, there was Sub-Rock 3D by Sega. Not a particularly good game, but it's notable perhaps for being in 3D. Before setting the world alight at Capcom with such games as 1942, Street Fighter II, Final Fight and the Resident Evil games, Yoshiki Otomoto at Konami created Time Pilot, a great innovative shooter that would set the rules for most shooters ever since. In the home market in 1982, some classic games were being released for the Atari VCS. First of all, we have Pitfall by David Crane at Activision. Pitfall was one of the first modern platform style games, and it came about when David Crane thought wouldn't it be good to be able to control a stick figure on the screen. Also this year in 1981 and 82, Howard Scott Warshaw was the new toast of Atari, releasing two great games for the Atari 2600. First of all, there was Yar's Revenge, a thoroughly enjoyable blaster where you controlled a fly called Yar. And he also created Indiana Jones, Raider of the Lost Ark, one of the first licensed games ever released, and a thoroughly enjoyable arcade adventure, being absolutely massive and intricate for the time. Well, I hope you enjoyed part 6 and look forward to part 7, where we talk about the Battle of the Schoolyard.